study of their mountaintop findings. They had friends working on many research projects throughout the United States and managed to visit and confer with them while on business trips. They investigated the possibility of unusual sunspot activity, but sunspots had been normal during the brief periods of high radiation. To clinch the elimination of sunspots as a cause, their record tapes showed no burst of radiation when sunspot activity had been abnormal. The rockhounds checked every possible research project that might have produced some stray radiation for their instruments to pick up. They found nothing. They checked and rechecked their instruments, but could find no factor that might have induced false readings. They let other scientists in on their findings, hoping that these outsiders might be able to put their fingers on errors that had been overlooked. Now, more than a year after the occurrence of the mysterious incidents that they had reported, a year spent in analyzing their data, the rockhounds had no answer. By the best scientific tests that they had been able to apply, the visual sightings and the high radiation had taken place more or less simultaneously. Intriguing ideas are hard to kill, and this one had more than one life, possibly because of the element of mystery which surrounds the subject of flying saucers. But the scientific mind thrives on taking the mystery out of unexplained events, so it is not surprising that the investigation went on. According to my friend the scientist, where the rockhounds worked, were told about the activities of the Mineral Club, and they started radiation detection groups of their own. For instance, 2 graduate astronomy students from a southwestern university started a similar watch on a modest scale, using a modified standard Geiger counter as their detection unit. They did not build a recorder into their equipment, however, and consequently were forced to man their equipment continuously, which naturally cut down the time they were in operation. On 2 occasions, they reportedly detected a burst of high radiation. Although the veracity of the 2 astronomers was not doubted, the scientist felt that the accuracy of their readings was poor because of the rather low quality of their equipment. The scientist then told me about a far more impressive effort to verify or disprove the findings of the Mineral Club. Word of the rockhounds and their work had also spread to a large laboratory in the east. An Air Force colonel, on duty at the lab, told the story to some of his friends, and they decided to look personally into the situation. Fortunately, these people were in a wonderful spot to make such an investigation. At their laboratory, an extensive survey of the surrounding area was being made. An elaborate system of radiation detection equipment had been set up for a radius of 100 miles around the lab. In addition, the defenses of the area included a radar net. Thanks to the flashing of silver eagles, the colonel's group got permission to check the records of the radiation survey station and to look over the logs of the radar stations. They found instances where, during the same period of time that radiation in the area had been much higher than normal, radar had had a UFO on the scope. These events had occurred during the period from January 1951 until about June 1951. Upon learning of the tentative but encouraging findings that the colonel's group had dug out of their past records, people on both the radiation survey crews and at the radar sites became interested in cooperating for further investigation. A tie-in with the local saucer grapevine established a 3-way check. One evening in July, just before sunset, 2 of the colonel's group were driving home from the laboratory. As they sped along the highway, they noticed 2 cars stopped ahead of them, the occupants were standing beside the road, looking at something in the sky. The two scientists stopped, got out of their car, and scanned the sky too. Low on the eastern horizon, they saw a bright circular object moving slowly north. They watched it for a while, took a few notes, then drove back to the lab. Some interesting news awaited them there. Radar had picked up an unidentified target near the spot where the scientists in the car had seen the UFO, and it had been traveling north. A fighter had been scrambled, but when it got into the proper area, the radar target was off the scope. The pilot glimpsed something that looked like the reported UFO, but before he could check further, he had to turn into the sun to get on an interception course, and he lost the object. Several days passed before the radiation reports from all stations could be collected. When the reports did come in, they showed that stations east of the laboratory, on an approximate line with the radar track, had shown the highest increase in radiation. Stations west of the lab showed nothing. The possible significance of this well-covered incident spurred the Colonel's group to extend and refine their activities. Their idea was to build a radiation detection instrument in an empty wing tank and hang the tank on an F-47. Then, when a UFO was reported, they would fly a search pattern in the area and try to establish whether or not a certain sector of the sky was more radioactive than other sectors. Also, they proposed to build a highly directional detector for the F-47 and attempt actually to track a UFO. The design of such equipment was started, but many delays occurred. Before the Colonel's group could get any of the equipment built, some of the members left the lab for other jobs, and the Colonel, who sparked the operation, was himself transferred elsewhere. The entire effort collapsed. The scientist was not surprised that I hadn't heard the story of the Colonel's group. All the people involved, he said, had kept it quiet in order to avoid ridicule. The scientist added that he would be glad to give me all the data he had on the sightings of his mineral club, and he told me where to get the information about the two astronomers and the Colonel's group. Armed with the scientist's notes and recorder tapes, I left from my office at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, Dayton. With the blessings of my chief, I started to run down the rest of the radiation information. The data we had, especially that from the scientist's mineral club, had been thoroughly analyzed, but we thought that since we now had access to more general data, something new and more significant might be found. First, I contacted the government agency for which all of the people involved in these investigations had been working, the scientists who recorded the original incident, the scientist and his mineral club, the Colonel's group, and the rest. The people in the agency were very cooperative, but stressed the fact that only the extracurricular affairs of the scientists involved had no official sanction and should not be tied in with the agency in any way, shape, or form. This closed-door reaction was typical of how the words flying saucer seemed to scare some people. They did help me locate the report on the original incident, however, and since it seemed to be the only existing copy, I arranged to borrow it. About this same time, we located the two graduate astronomy students in New Mexico. Both now had their PhDs and held responsible jobs on highly classified projects. They repeated their story, which I had first heard from the scientist, but had kept no record of their activities. On one occasion, just before dawn on a Sunday morning, they were on the roof making some meteorological observations. One of them was listening to the Geiger counter when he detected a definite increase in the clicking. just as the frequency of the clicks reached its highest peak, almost a steady buzz, a large fireball, described by them as spectacular, flashed across the sky. Both of the observers had seen several of the green fireballs and said that this object was similar in all respects except that the color was a brilliant blue-white. With the disappearance of the fireball, the counter once more settled down to a steady click per second. They added that once before they had detected a similar increase in the frequency of the clicks, but had seen nothing in the sky. In telling their story, both astronomers stressed the point that their data were open to a great deal of criticism, mainly because of the limited instrumentation they had used. We agreed. Still, their work tended to support the findings of the more elaborate and systematic radiation investigations. The gods who watch over the UFO project were smiling about this time because one morning I got a call from a colonel on Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. He was going to be in our area that morning and planned to stop in to see me. He arrived in a few minutes and turned out to be none other than the colonel who had headed the group which had investigated UFOs and radiation at the Eastern Laboratory. He repeated his story. It was the same as I had heard from the scientist, with a few insignificant changes. The colonel had no records of his group's operations, but knew who had them. He promised to get a wire off to the person immediately, which he did. The answer was a bit disappointing. During the intervening months, the data had been scattered out among the members of the colonel's group, and when the group broke up, so did its collection of records. So all we had to fall back on was the colonel's word, but since he now was heading a top priority project at Wright, it would be difficult not to believe him. After obtaining the colonel's story, we collected all available data concerning known incidents in which there seemed to be a correlation between the visual sighting of UFOs and the presence of excess atomic radiation in the area of the sightings. There was one last thing to do. I wanted to take the dates and times of all the reported radiation increases and check them against all sources of UFO reports. This project would take a lot of legwork and digging, but I felt that it would offer the most positive and complete evidence we could assemble as to whether or not a correlation existed. Accordingly, we dug into our files, ADC radar logs, press wire service files, newspaper morgues in the sighting area, and the files of individuals who collect data on saucers. Whenever we found a visual report that correlated with a radiation peak, we checked it against weather conditions, balloon tracks, astronomical reports, etc. As soon as the data had all been assembled, I arranged for a group of Air Force consultants to look it over. I got the same old answer. The data still aren't good enough. The men were very much interested in the reports, but when it came time to putting their comments on paper, they said, "Not enough conclusive evidence." If in some ways the UFOs could have been photographed at the same time that the radiation